For our listeners who might not have heard of Shippo, could you explain what Shippo do?
Shippo basically provides a platform and a web app for e-commerce merchants to find the best shipping provider for their merchandise. We also have an API, a platform API, which is the bigger offering, which is used by platform partners like the likes of Shopify and Wix.
Did the pandemic help in any way, given that it's e-commerce?
So yes, Shippo, a company like Shippo, e-commerce did boom during the pandemic. It reached its peak.
And do you feel like companies in this day and age should implement, setting boundaries?
Companies should respect, and I always do that. You do not send a one-on-one email or a Slack message to somebody who's on vacation unless absolutely necessary. If
Feedback is so important. Are you someone who constantly seeks out feedback?
I believe a good relationship is built, especially when you're a leader and your teams. You build a good relationship by constantly providing feedback. For me as well, I constantly try to get feedback from my peers and my bosses.
What would you say then is the best bit of feedback you've received in business or in your career?
The best feedback was listen. As simple as that. Listen to people, be the last one to speak.
Ashutosh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
I've known you for quite some time. And one thing I find really intriguing is obviously the route you took to becoming a technology leader. It wasn't the most traditional route, was it?
It was not the most traditional route to enter the technology field per se. Technology leader comes at a later point of time. You don't start your career by thinking of becoming a leader.
Yeah.
But I did my graduation in civil engineering. Although I was always interested in programming and software, even before going to college. My first software project was during my summer internship during the civil engineering course for a civil engineering company called Scott Wilson Kirkpatrick. I built a C++ application for them that was helping them find the best place, the best position across a few towns. Like basically, they were trying to place a toll booth and they were trying to look at where's the best place to keep that. So I kind of built a software for them. That was my first foray into building a full-blown software application.
That's when you realized you wanted to be a software programmer and not a civil engineer then.
Yes, I realized before that, actually, to be honest. This was the first time that was kind of validation that I could do it.
Yeah.
Because I had done school and college projects, and those are way easier, right? This was my first industry project. I spent 2 months building that, sitting in an office. So that's when I realized, I can do it.
Yeah. And now fast forward, and you are the European engineering site leader for Shippo.
Yes.
And for our listeners who might not have heard of Shippo, could you explain what Shippo do?
So Shippo is a startup based in San Francisco, and I'm heading their European operations. Shippo basically provides a platform and a web app for e-commerce merchants to find the best shipping provider for their merchandise. So we have a web app that is used by merchants directly. You can log into the web app and you can find a comparison across multiple shipping providers from your source to destination. We also have an API, a platform API, which is the bigger offering, which is used by platform partners like the likes of Shopify and Wix, who provide shipping solutions to their customers powered by Shippo.
And a company like Shippo, obviously the industry that it's in, would it be fair to say that did the pandemic help in any way, given that it's e-commerce?
So yes, Shippo, a company like Shippo, e-commerce did boom during the pandemic. It reached its peak. During the pandemic, people started buying online a lot more. A lot of merchants, especially small merchants, were not able to cope up with people not going to stores. So this kind of forced or accelerated a lot of e-commerce growth, especially to the small merchants, right? So it did get a big boost, and Shippo, because it depends or it augments e-commerce. Shipping is an integral part of e-commerce. Shopping and shipping, those are the two basically. You shop and the merchant ships you back. So there was a drastic growth, yes, of course.
And how do you find now, I guess the market has changed, people are back shopping, they're in store. Are companies like Shopify, Shippo, different e-commerce kind of base companies, are they being heavily affected now? Are things changing, do you feel?
Uh, I wouldn't say they are being heavily affected. They are definitely affected, and the reason that I see across, well, Shippo is a smaller company, but even the likes of Shopify and Amazon, and the big e-commerce retailers as well, even Walmart e-commerce, for example, um, the growth that they saw during the pandemic was exceptional. It reached a high, and a lot of the projections were based on that growth continuing. Now that was hard to sustain because as we came out of the pandemic, people, went to shop offline more. Now, the well, it did definitely. The pandemic changed habits, right? So people are used to buying online more. So the e-commerce volume today is still higher than the pre-pandemic levels, but it is not at the highest point that was reached during the pandemic. So there was a wave, and now it's fallen down a little bit. What has happened is most companies did their projections, revenue projections, and their forecasts, financial forecasts, based on that sustained growth, which is not the case. So that's what is affecting the e-commerce companies mainly.
Okay, okay. And given your own journey, it's been an exciting one. So you started as a software engineer in India, with Dean. Then you impressed the mothership in San Francisco, so you got moved over there as director of operations, and then you got the task, I guess, to open up in Ireland and the European operations. How did you find that journey?
Yeah. So first of all, no, I was not the director of operations in San Francisco. I was the
Okay.
director of operations in Ireland, right? So and I started my career 3 years before Dean in other companies as a software engineer. At Dean, I started as a software engineer and kind of was leading a few teams by the time I moved from Bangalore to San Francisco. In San Francisco, I ended up managing a couple of teams. I kind of Dean is in the corporate travel and expense businesses. They started with travel, and I was kind of one of the initial engineers on the expense platform. So I kind of architected the expense platform back in Bangalore, started there, and then moved up to San Francisco. And then 12 years later, 12 years after I had joined Dean, they asked me if I was, they were expanding in Europe, and I was given the offer to move to Ireland and lead that operation, build and set up and lead that operation. If you talk to my boss at the time, he would say he had to untwist me a lot. I don't necessarily agree with that, but the journey was amazing, to be honest. Having stayed at Deem for 15 years before I quit Deem, January of this year, I got to learn so much across different products, different areas. I grew up as a person. I grew up as a leader. When I moved from San Francisco to Ireland to set up the Irish operations, I did things I had never done or never known I could do. For example, the first 6 months after I moved here, I was away from technology. I am an engineer at heart, and that was very hard for me. Also, there were things where I was working with the government, working with lawyers, with financial firms, with marketeers, with the press, there's a lot of real estate agents trying to find an office space. There's a lot of new things that I enjoyed doing. I learned. Of course, it was not easy, but at the end, it was satisfying to see, what I was able to build, set up teams, team here, build a culture here. I was able to build a team of 30 people in the first 6 months. Mind you, this was pre-pandemic, the second half of 2019. And overall, it was an enriching experience to me. Deem, over the 3 years I was here, we were able to grow up to a size of 50, even though this was during the pandemic and we were in the travel space, business travel space, and nobody was traveling. It was harder. But all in all, it was a fascinating journey.
And you mentioned it there. Is it difficult to let go of the reins when you're so hands-on, as you said, architecture, software engineering, you're so involved, to take a step back, as a leader? Is that quite difficult?
It is hard, indeed. It is really hard. And, till I was in San Francisco, I had 2 teams and I was still deeply involved in coding and architecture and the technology side of it. And when I moved to Dublin, well, as I said, for the first few months, I didn't have the time to get involved, even though I was wanting to go back to it. But I was okay. I would occasionally, as I was walking past the hallways in the office, and that time people used to go to the office every day. I would, if there's something interesting on the whiteboard, I would stand back and start participating if I had the time, and I enjoyed doing that. It definitely is hard, and as a leader, you kind of you have to make a conscious effort because you hire people to do that, and you don't want to be getting involved in low level details all the time. But then there are times when engineers especially like if leaders do that. They appreciate that. Of course, I appreciate doing that myself. So that it lets me, as a leader, it helps me understand some of the problems that the teams are facing, uh, and better relate to what they're working on. So it's I guess it's a mix. I mean, I would like to step away as a leader, but it does help to get involved once in a while. Maybe not at a very low level. Like I would at the beginning, I would still be involved. I would still be reviewing code, right? I would like to write code, but I didn't have the time. But even code review, I learned it the hard way. Sometimes when you are a leader and you are high up and you add a comment on a code, and there's another engineer commenting in a different direction, it can put undue pressure,
Yeah.
right? And that's the reason you have to detach yourselves from there eventually.
Is it important to be coming from a strong engineering background to be a leader, to gain respect of the engineering team?
That's a tricky question because I've seen both kinds of leaders and I've seen both kinds of leaders being successful. I am the kind of leader who's been there, done that, and comes from that background, right? So when you ask me, is it important? I think it is important not necessarily to be an engineer in your past life, but definitely to be able to understand some of the technical details, right? And somebody's coming from the outside, and also it also depends on the size of the way your org is structured, and in most startups the orgs are relatively flat, so you are closer to technology anyways, as opposed to a bigger company where you might have multiple levels in hierarchy, and you are further apart anyways. So in that case, it may be easier for you to be not involved at the grassroots level, or may not be even required to come from that background. But if you ask me, it did help me grow up as a leader.
Yeah.
Because I came from there. Even today, I understand the challenges people face.
Yeah.
So that does help me.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. When someone kind of sees their manager who, as you say, has been there and done that.
Yes.
They may feel in safe hands.
Yes.
When that happens. In regards to the changes you went from on your leadership journey, India, then San Francisco, then Ireland, was there major culture shocks, even just within the tech team, the tech culture?
I wouldn't say shocks, but there are definitely major cultural differences, right? When I went to Bangalore, from Bangalore to San Francisco, well, the reason it was not also a shock because I had been traveling back and forth anyways, and I was working closely with the teams in San Francisco, so I kind of knew the culture. When I moved from San Francisco to Ireland, that was different because I had never worked with an Irish team or Irish companies. So the cultures are, I guess the cultures are definitely different. But then between San Francisco and Bangalore, or within any company, basically, multiple offices of a company, if they're working closely with each other, the culture at each location is a blend of that local culture plus the company culture, right? So when I was in Bangalore and in San Francisco, we still understood each other's, opinions and way of talking, and understood the nuances. When I moved from San Francisco to Ireland, I was trying to understand the culture because I knew the culture was different. Although before I actually moved, I did travel for about a year back and forth. I was here almost every other month. And I was able to understand the local culture because my job involved meeting a lot of people before I actually moved, right, during the setup phase. So that helped me understand the little cultural nuances, But then when I started building a team, that what was very, I'd say, helpful is I had been in the company for so long, so I knew the culture, and I knew the culture. I knew the culture at Dean, but I also kind of understood the working culture in San Francisco because I had been there, and you tend to understand that. And I remember clearly there was a very heavy focus that me and the rest of the leadership team at Dean had to make sure that the culture that we set up in the new team is a merger, a combination of the Dean culture and the Irish culture, right? So if you ask me the cultural differences, there are, of course, well, to be honest, sorry, taking a step back, the culture in Ireland is something I found in between Bangalore and San Francisco. And
Okay,
because, so
yeah.
Bangalore San Francisco is kind of extreme in some ways. And the Irish culture by itself, I found sitting somewhere in between. So it was very easy for me to adapt to it and kind of also propagate that. But I see that there is the Irish or European culture in general is slightly more relaxed. Not that they don't get the same stuff done. I mean, to be honest, I've seen Irish engineers being more productive sometimes than the counterparts in the Bay Area. But there's a different sense of, not a sense, but I think things are a little rushed sometimes in the Bay Area, and they're much more serious
Yeah.
about work, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. But what I see in Ireland is people tend to be lighthearted more often at work than in the Bay Area, right? So that was one big change for me, getting to understand the Irish humor,
Yeah.
which was
Big part of it.
which was sometimes kind of different than the Bay Area, right? But all in all, people are more laid back, more relaxed. They take when they take a vacation, they do take a vacation. They're not checking their phones all the time, and I think that is important because you
yeah.
need to actually, turn it off completely once in a while to rejuvenate your mind and energies.
Yeah.
Whereas, well, we also have a larger number of vacation days in Europe in general than the US, so that I think that helps. But that was a big difference.
And do you lead by example then in terms of switching off? How do you switch off? Do you ever switch off?
I do switch off. I have to switch off. What I've seen what happens is when you work with a US company, like I've done at Deem and Shippo, because your teams, you almost never build a silo. You would always want to build a team that is working with the mothership, right? And there's exchange of information and ideas and processes required anyways. The local teams do get influenced by the way the people work there, so they do not tend to switch off as often. So I do lead by example. I take time off. It's not always possible, to be honest, to be completely off the grid. So I do have an eye on my phone every once in a while. I try not to respond
Yeah.
to anything.
Yeah.
I'm more of a silent spectator, things happening. And I of course I do tell my teams or anybody I work with when I go on vacation, that my phone is always there, and if necessary, ring me up directly on my phone. But then I do switch off. Again, depends on what I'm doing. So if I'm vacationing, or if I'm in London for a week, I mean, of course I have good connectivity, and
Yeah.
in the evenings I'll check my email once in a while, right? If I'm road tripping in Morocco, for instance, I may not really have that kind of luxury, or I may not want to do that, right? So
Yeah.
I'll be able to completely turn off. But I also choose the times I do my complete switch off. There are times when people need you and you just cannot. Being a leader adds that additional responsibility. But I firmly believe switching off is very important.
And do you feel like companies in this day and age should implement, I guess, setting boundaries to make sure people switch off? Nothing on Slack, let's say, no emails after a certain time, or is that going a step too far?
That's a lot of people talk about that. I don't think it's possible. Just because you work as a team. When you work as a team, you're part of email groups, you're part of Slack groups, you're part of communication that comes to you, not directly, right? So you cannot avoid that, right? Now companies should respect, and I always do that. You do not send a one-on-one email or a Slack message to somebody who's on vacation unless absolutely necessary. If production is down and there's only one person who can fix it and he's on vacation, I'll chase him down basically, to make it work. But that has never happened. In the past 3 years, that has never happened to me. But there's a lot of communication that happens in this day and age. Communication is key within the company as well. There's just a ton of emails and messages flowing around all across, and with the globally distributed teams, it's not always possible to do everything on meetings. So asynchronous communication is important. You cannot prevent that, right? But I would like to not disturb somebody by sending a one-on-one email or a message while they're on vacation.
Yeah, unless absolutely urgent.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's a good way to go about it. And being someone who's worked at scaling businesses, obviously there's always unforeseen circumstances and things. What are some of the biggest challenges you faced?
This may sound cliched, but COVID.
Yeah.
And I was I moved. We started Deem in August of 2019, 6 months before COVID hit in February of 2020. Right, and I was scaling up. I was fortunate enough to be able to hire 30 rock solid engineers and designers and product managers in the first 6 months. We had plans to go further ahead, and the plan was to build a team of 50 in the first 1 year. By the end of 2019, I thought I was ahead, but then COVID happened. And how do you sell a travel company to a potential candidate during COVID? People stopped travel completely. Business travel especially, right? There was no urgency for any business travel. People were still traveling on personal reasons because of urgent needs. So that was the biggest hurdle that I faced in scaling up. We actually had to pause our hiring for, I think it was over a year, just because we couldn't do it. So we had our plans, our roadmap, and the idea of building the Dublin team was to modernize Deem's architecture and the platform. And we had to change our plans because we couldn't hire people.
And do you feel, especially given that it's business travel, is that an industry now that has bounced back or will bounce back? Or have companies realized over COVID, a lot of this can be done virtually? We don't need to pay for business class flights every week.
Yeah. That's a tough one to answer. I've seen companies bouncing back, and I've seen companies skimping on business travel for the very reason that you could, work remotely as well. Now, business travel was not always done because you had to do meetings face to face. There were other reasons. The biggest reasons being, and I'm talking of business travel within a team. I'm not talking of business travel for sales. And I think sales and the a lot of those things can still happen remotely, and they do. But then there's always a different connection that you build when you meet people face to face. But for a tech company like the ones I've been working on, business travel is also sometimes used as a perk. It is also a necessity sometimes for team bonding. A lot of companies have done a lot of business travel right outside the pandemic because they hired, even Shippo. We hired a ton of people during the pandemic who had never seen each other face to face. So business travel became necessary because then you're kind of, you're meeting people, you're spending some time with them, understanding, whiteboarding becomes important, even customer side, meeting the customer face to face and understanding their pain points is different than doing it over the phone. But yes, I think companies have, I would say, gotten more conscious and more streamlined about business travel. And that's a good thing. Business travel is not just approved because somebody wants to travel. So that in the past that may have happened. Now people are, companies are having a double second look at it because unless it's important, why spend the money?
Yeah.
So there's a readjustment happening, and it's not settled yet. There is pent-up travel, both on the business travel side and personal travel side. So that is happening definitely this year. I mean, I traveled 3 times this year already after June to San Francisco, whereas I didn't travel 3 times in the last 3 years at all.
Yeah.
It does help. A lot of companies are also going remote now. So they're realizing that you don't really need an office. which means they're hiring everywhere, which means they need to arrange kind of offsites, regular offsites, so that people can come and meet and collaborate, right? So that increases the need for business travel. So short answer is it has increased in some areas, but it is also reducing in some areas, and then companies are taking a hard look and making a conscious decision on arranging and sponsoring business travel more than previously.
Yeah, as you say, it's a readjustment. And given your role as a technology leader during COVID, was that the most difficult time as a tech leader? What did you learn about yourself during that time?
During the COVID time,
Yeah.
it was a difficult time, not only to hire new people, but also to retain and keep the motivation high, right? And that's not just for myself, but for my teams as well. That was a hard bit there. What I learned about myself during COVID is that I could work remotely more efficiently.
Yeah.
But there were areas that I needed to meet people in person, right? And I think that's nothing new. I mean, you would have heard almost everybody say that. That's something that you learn. What you also learn is that business finds a way. Things happen. The first few months, there was uncertainty, and people didn't expect it to last. I didn't expect it to last so long. So there was always a hope that this is short-lived, and maybe 2 months later we'll come back. Okay, 3 more months or 6 more months. But then by the end of the year, end of 2020, it became a reality, and people got used to working in the new model. That became the new norm. I did learn that Zoom can be useful, but can also be boring and tiring
Yeah.
sometimes. You kind of have to follow a different discipline with yourself when you are in Zoom meetings back to back. Yeah.
Yeah, I can take it out of you. I think with remote working, the first thing people were saying is, oh, it's an increase in productivity. But as you mentioned there, creativity, culture, meeting your team. I can only imagine them trying to develop the iPhone all working remotely. I don't think it would have happened, or it wouldn't have happened as quickly,
Yes.
or that creativity might have been lost. So it is imperative that people do meet face to face as well.
Yeah. I mean, it also depends on the kind of business, right? And kind of work you're doing. For a pure software player, you work on your laptop all day long. You can be sitting anywhere in the world and working on your laptop, right? For business leaders, you can. But for building an iPhone, I mean, you need people in the plant,
Yeah.
like Tesla. I mean, people had to be in the factory to make it work, right? But even in the software space, the creativity and the collaboration, right, is hard to do on your own. Now, remote work is not new, and people have been working remotely all their lives. I mean, since I was in the US, I've had people who've been working remotely forever, right? But then they continuously travel back and forth. They meet with other people, they collaborate. There are other means of collaboration. But again, the collaboration also, I think you cannot force sometimes. You cannot force collaboration. You can definitely not force creativity. It comes to you when it comes to you. But even collaboration, you cannot say, here is 2 hours, get on Zoom and collaborate and bring the best ideas. You can, and people do that all the time. But there are times when you contrast that to being in the office, and you had 2 hours in the office, you take a 10-minute coffee break in between. You go out for lunch afterwards.
Yeah.
And you inevitably end up talking about work and collaborating more. And that organic collaboration, I think, is extremely important. That is something that you miss in a fully remote model, which is why companies that are adopting a fully remote model, like even at Shippo, I mean, we're adopting a remote model, but then we would have, all leaders will have budgets to arrange offsites multiple times a year.
Yeah.
So that's necessary. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess in terms of collaboration, which you mentioned there, feedback is so important. Are you someone who constantly seeks out feedback from peers, from your own manager, from your boss?
I do. I am actually a big proponent of seeking and providing feedback. Right. To me, well, what I try to do is I try not to wait for somebody to ask for feedback, right? I believe a good relationship is built, especially when you're a leader and your teams. You build a good relationship by constantly providing feedback. Of course, both kinds of feedbacks are important, positive as well as constructive. Uh, it is a constant need for me as well. I constantly try to get feedback from my peers and my bosses, but at the same time, I also provide feedback to everybody. I mean, and you know that's also the other thing. I mean, you don't have to really depend. Again, depends on the kind of feedback you're providing and how hard it is gonna hit. A good feedback is always easy. You can just throw it around anytime. But constructive feedback takes some planning and some thought, which also becomes harder, to be honest. Going back to the previous point, it becomes harder to provide feedback online.
On a Zoom, yes, yeah.
But then for a global team, there will be times when you have part of the team online, remote, and you cannot wait to meet them face to face,
Yeah.
right? But then it depends. If you're meeting somebody, you have a hard talk with somebody, it's easier to have it over coffee.
Yeah, oh, definitely, 100%.
Yeah, but then it's important to provide feedback constantly. And I kind of do that even with my peers and my bosses. I also provide feedback.
Yeah.
I'm not shy of providing feedback because at the end of it, it's nothing personal. It's just the way we work. And if a team or a company is working on a specific goal, you're all in together and you all work. It's your job as a leader. I think it's my job to provide feedback to see if somebody's going in a different direction or if things can be improved. Why not?
What would you say then is the best bit of feedback you've received in business or in your career?
The best feedback I've received as I went on to the managerial leadership roles back in San Francisco, the best feedback was listen. As simple as that. Listen to people, be the last one to speak. I think that's the most valuable feedback that I received from my then director of engineering, who made me a manager and coached me on it. It is important for you to listen to people coming to you with a problem before jumping on to a solution.
Yeah. I guess that's such an important trait for a technology leader.
Yeah.
Listening. What do you believe makes a great technology leader? Could you pinpoint a number of things?
We just talked about listening, definitely.
Yeah.
Being empathetic. Empathy is a big element in a technology leader. You kind of have to understand the other person's perspective and work with them. I am also a firm believer of trust and transparency. I think they go hand in hand. You earn trust by being transparent, and you earn trust by trusting people. So there are, you kind of, there's no two ways around it. You have to trust people, and people have to trust you for you to be able to operate as a team working towards the same goal.
Yeah, I think that book, is it Ray Dalio mentions it, Radical Transparency, and how important that is.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to, especially as you said, when it comes to feedback, whether it be positive or constructive.
True.
It's so important. Do you ever have imposter syndrome when you walk into a leadership role, when you go to set up Irish operations, EU operations, you're hiring software engineers, you have to stand up, you have to lead them, you have to be leading the charge. Does that ever creep in?
More than I would like to. It creeps in more than I would like to. When you do something new and you see people who've been doing that for a long while, right? That does creep in. Imposter syndrome is real, I would say.
Yeah. No, it definitely is. One of our past guests, Olivia Leonard, who works at Meta, she says it creeps in, but when you're full of confidence, it doesn't really seem to creep in. It's always when you're doubting yourself.
Yeah, I mean, eventually it does creep in, but when you get things right and when you it definitely creeps in when you are on your lows.
Yeah.
Right. But it doesn't take, if you're strong enough, as I said, if you're confident enough, if you have your goals set right, and you have a clear thought process, you will come out of that low.
Yeah.
And the imposter syndrome goes away. As simple as that. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you have anyone either professionally or personally, that serves as your sounding board when it comes to bouncing ideas off, chatting to?
It's a good question. I have many people like that. You know, I'm a very collaborative person. I like to run ideas. I do not want to think of an idea in my head and kind of strongly believe in it, unless I share with some people and see their perspective as well. Uh, but also it depends uh, on the magnitude of the decision that is related to that idea, and the impact it's going to have. Uh, for for most day-to-day things, the way I'm set up, I feel uh, I'm able to work with either my managers who report to me, or my seniors, depending on what the influence is going to be. Uh, but for big radical ideas, I do have a good connection of people in India, US, and now in Ireland as well.
Yeah.
Good connection of professionals. I've got a lot of my classmates run unicorn companies in India and US. So I reach out to my professional network. Even though I might not have spoken to them in the past couple of years, few years, depending on if I need their advice on something that I think they are proficient in, I wouldn't feel bad in reaching out to them. So my ex bosses, for example, my CTOs, my VPs, my directors in the past, my classmates. So there's no short answer to it. There's no one person.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It depends on what you can seek advice on from whom.
It's great to have that network of support when it comes to, as like we talked about, ideas or even planning for the future. What about yourself? Do you plan ahead? How far do you plan ahead? What's the future look like? Do you think 5 years, 10 years down the line?
It's very hard. Well, it's very hard to plan 5 years, 10 years down the line on where you would be. Of course, I do plan my finances 5, 10 years down the line, and I do plan some things down the line. I'm usually plan ahead. I'm a big planner. For small things and big things as well. You have to create a plan and then execute it. The key is to kind of be flexible, and as you learn more information, be able to switch your plan. Reprioritize your elements in the plan as well. To answer that direct question, what does future look like for me? Well, I've been leading teams and building teams and setting up teams in the past 3-4 years in Ireland, and helping companies expand and scale up. My plan is to continue doing that. My plan is to be able to help more companies who need that kind of support. Having done this twice already, I kind of have a good idea, and I've learned a lot from my mistakes, from my failures. But there's no set plan, as you say. My plan is to kind of continue working, enjoy working, build, nurture, and cherish good teams.
Yeah. Yeah.
It kind of sounds vague, but that's a plan.
Yeah. Once everything kind of centers around there, then you'll be okay.
Yes.
No, that's great. In terms of how I like to finish the podcast, this part is a couple of quick fire questions.
Sure.
If you're okay with that,
Yeah.
I'll hit you with number one. Something you wish you did earlier on in your career?
I wish I joined a very early stage startup earlier on in my career.
Was that just to give you, more exposure and somewhere where you can make more of an impact?
Yes, the latter. I'm always looking for more impact and more contribution. So that's the idea. I would have been able to, because what I learned much later in my career is I can do multiple things, multiple different things, and I was not able to apply all of that. I didn't know about myself.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. Do you have a biggest failure or something that keeps you up at night?
The biggest failure is hard to pinpoint, but there are a lot of things that keep me up at night. Something from the recent past, maybe looking at my experience at Shippo, having tasks with an idea to build a team. I was not able to make a quick progress at the beginning. was trying to be more organized and kind of also, well, part of it was also because the company directions were changing and the economy was changing in general. But I wish I had, you know, pushed harder against, and went on and helped people regardless of the direction.
Just power through.
Yeah.
Who's your biggest inspiration? Has it changed over time?
There is no one person. It keeps on changing all the time.
Yeah.
I do get inspired by a lot of my leaders that I work with closely, my founders. I do get inspired by. Well, to be honest, inspiration is around you. I mean, this might sound cliched or even poetic. Inspiration is all around you. You just have to find things that inspire you, and there's no one person that I would say. I would never like to make one person as a role model, because there are always pros and cons. You take some good qualities from one person, something else from somebody else. So my leaders in the past have inspired me. Of course, the tech personalities. I mean, it's hard to not be inspired by Elon Musk and Bill Gates. Everybody, Richard Branson. Doesn't mean you follow everything that they do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Yeah, no, that's good to know. What do you think of Elon Musk and everything that's going on now? Or is that another podcast that we need to do?
Well, that is another podcast. I can talk about Elon Musk. I think, and he's a man who believes in himself.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest takeaway for me. What I wouldn't comment on what he's doing and what's happening in his companies. But this is a man who exudes confidence and who believes in himself.
100%, yeah. Is there anything you have read or watched that has changed your life? Any book? Any movie?
The book that comes to mind is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie.
Oh, yeah.
And I read this, again, I think probably 10 years ago. But that just changed my outlook about how to work with people and how, people are the biggest assets in a company. And it's very important to kind of work with them, understand them. And that, once you have, you always depend on people to work together.
Very good. I think you're the second guest who's named that book. So,
really?
Yeah. Let's see, can we get the tree? What's the most important risk you've taken and why?
Moving to Dublin, uprooting my family in San Francisco and moving to Ireland. That was a big risk.
Yeah.
And most important risk in my career and personal life as well, to be honest. Yeah.
And one you wouldn't change looking back now?
No, I wouldn't change that, no.
Brilliant.
I'm happy with that risk.
Very good. Very good. We usually do a pass the ball exercise, if you could call it that, at the end of every podcast, where you, let's say, nominate one person or one tech leader. It could be someone you know. It could be Elon, it could be anyone, but probably more chance of us getting on the podcast if you do know them. Or
Well, I wish you get Elon Musk on your podcast.
That's a bit further down the line. But is there anyone that comes to mind that you'd love to hear on this podcast?
Robert McGarry from Toast.
Ah, very good.
Yeah. He's done an immense job in building Toast. I met him when I was traveling from San Francisco.
Yeah.
And Toast was 11-man team and a small office. And they've grown so big now.
Oh, they've done brilliantly, haven't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. Okay, when I reach out, I'll name drop you.
Yeah, definitely.
No, perfect. Look, thanks for coming on to the podcast. I really enjoyed this episode. It's very inspiring. I think our listeners will be inspired by it as well. Any aspiring tech leaders out there. So thanks for coming on, and it was great to have you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it as well. Almost as much as you did.
Good man. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.